Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 46 of Camerata Pacifica's Concerts at Home. My name is Adrian Spence. I'm the artistic director for Camerata Pacifica. And today we have one piece of music for you, a piano sonata by Beethoven, performed by my friend and colleague, Gilles Vonsattel. And the one piano sonata by Beethoven, and it happens to be his final piano sonata, the opus 111. It was recorded, this was back in February 2019, so 2 years ago.
Yep.
And it was part of our Why Beethoven Festival, or the Why Beethoven 2 seasons of looking at why Beethoven's music has such an impact still today, and the background of the composer. And throughout the 20 programs over the 2 seasons, we included late works by composers, Haydn, Bach, Schubert, final piano sonatas of Haydn and Schubert and Beethoven. And I wanted to program just this piece today because it is such a magnificent and mighty piece of music, and we're going to ask you for your thoughts on it. But I'm going to lead off the question. When we talk about late works, or we talk about final works, we only realize them to be final, or we only realize them to be late after the fact, because we don't know. But Beethoven was leading it was reasonable to expect that he was in the last quarter of the life game. And so do you think he intended this to be his last sonata for piano? Because there was a lot of music to come afterwards.
That's the thing. Yeah, exactly what you just said. That's the puzzle, because you think, okay, final piano sonata, but actually there are many opuses that come after, a lot of activity, a lot of creative activity. And he had this pattern in his life. Most of the time, the 32 piano sonatas, he writes them pretty consistently. There's like one little dry spell for a few years around opus 81A, the Les Adieux sonata, but mostly he's churning them out and he's using them as laboratories for experiments, right? For experimentation for the most part. And in this case, it's hard not to shake that feeling. I mean, how much is affected by, we know I'm playing the last Beethoven piano sonata, but at the same time, there are characteristics of this piece that seem to kind of sum up his art on the piano in many ways. There is, we were talking before, you mentioned the key being significant, right? A bit of a signature key. Some composers have signature keys that mean things to them. C minor for Beethoven is at the top of the list for us in music. And here he is revisiting his key of C minor and writing an almost caricature like C minor mood opening. It's like, I'm doing it again, and also mimicking that French overture rhythm of pa-pam, pa-pam, that kind of processional that was in the Pathétique Sonata a long time ago for him, which is one of his iconic works. So we're back in that world. And sure enough, there's that feeling in that Beethoven introduction of like nothing is happening, right? Time is just still, and there's like slow half steps, and then there's an eruption, as there always is, right? And so we're kind of at it again, and it's this time what's kind of what I love about this first movement too is this kind of crazy Bach-like keyboard writing, that he has more command of that kind of stuff now. He's gotten more interested in that kind of writing. So you have it with an even more demonic energy than before, more counterpoint. And also the end is so mysterious, right? How he leaves you at the end of the first movement. But first movement, he's definitely kind of back at it, back on the horse, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, back in the heroic horse. I mean, I went back and forward with Richard O'Neill and about Richard didn't always care for using the term heroic, because a lot of music that is in his middle period is not heroic.
not necessarily heroic,
and
right?
Richard Daniel Chua and I, we went round and round on this, but the opening of the piece is so heroic.
It's you know, there's something already from French overtures in Bach that's already noble and heroic. It's that upright rhythm, and then you combine that rhythm with like those massive chords, and it's just etched in rock. It feels like, you know, this kind of opening. So yes, like titanic, heroic, those words apply. You know, it's like we have that image of the statue of Beethoven that's like imposing, we all saw when we were kids, that was looming over us, this person looking like brooding. And you know, there's like, I actually just revisited, I have a kids book about Beethoven that I found in my stuff in Switzerland that I'm passing on to my son now as he's learning his first Beethoven piece on violin at age 6. And it mentions this sort of legend about the end of Beethoven's death, but it presents it as pure fact, you know, that he died in a thunderstorm and he raised his fist. And you know, there is that cult of Beethoven, you know, that and it's very satisfying because he's such a strong personality, and it's very appealing, and that this beginning can fit into that so easily, because of its strength, you know.
Yeah, and if we go back, I'm coming back again to C minor because I'm thinking of Opus 1. Opus 1 number 3 is in C minor, the piano trios.
Yep.
And then, of course, the C minor with which most people are familiar is the Fifth Symphony.
Yep, that's the, yeah, right.
So, yeah. So one does get, I mean, I let off the question, but one really does get the impression that this was an intentional. I'm closing the book on piano sonatas at this point.
Yeah, yeah. There is definitely that feeling. There's also the extraordinary close of the sonata itself, the way it ends, also in the key of C major, which is like when you begin your journey in music, you know, that first prelude from Bach and the preludes and fugues. I mean, it's sort of the beginning, you know, of this kind of tonal music. And the way that the second movement ends seems to just close that journey off, you know, in its extraordinary simplicity. Um, so yes, I think it's very easy to convince me that he had that in mind, and he certainly could have written more piano sonatas, and he didn't. So he obviously chose other vehicles for solo piano. He wrote small pieces or cycles, right? So
yeah, and then and I think with the piano sonatas, you have like the string quartets. You have such a span of his. It's a catalog of his composition.
that's right.
And into so this is 111. So the late string quartets start with 127. There's a lot of music still to come. All of the late string quartets.
But typically in his output, he will experiment first in the piano sonatas, and then you see the Funeral March and Eroica first is in Opus 26 of the piano sonatas. Like there's his ability to mess around on his instrument at home on the piano and try things out. And so the Hammerklavier being like this massive experiment, right, of that kind. And then later you see, you know, so you can see, and a lot of the characteristics of the late piano sonatas show up in the quartets. There's two things that come to mind about this sonata to me just now. One of them is the searching for extremes of registers. So you have the left hand growling around in the bass while the right hand's like way up high, you know, searching for, and then the quartets, that's famous, right? In the late quartets, that suddenly you're hearing this like violin playing and the cellos, you know. So that's already present in the sonata you'll hear, as well as this, of course, the extraordinary tenderness, the search for simplicity. That's all there as well. And the experimentation with form. I mean, the way the first movement melts into the second movement, like what are we hearing there in terms of like, you know, we're in a different universe than a 3-4 movement sonata, right?
Yeah. I think it's important if we're talking about the first and the second movement to share. If you don't know the piece, there are two movements. This is a 2-movement sonata. And I'm reminded of, I can't remember the quote, but I'm reminded of something he said after, just around this piece, or maybe after its publication, about the piano being an unsatisfactory instrument.
Yeah.
That he's just, because I mean, what the instrument, what can you, how, because also he's completely deaf at this point in time.
Right, right. And
So
he's
that's
trying.
also why people suggest that's also
Yep.
why he's at the extreme end of the instrument, because
Yeah. Well, there, and also the other thing I wanted to say is the use of silence as a sort of climactic. You're reaching for something that's impossible in terms of intensity of expression. It can't be done. It's so far beyond the limitations. And I think there's that famous story too, where Beethoven tells Schuppanzig, "What do I care about your fiddle and what it
yeah.
can?" You know, and like so, he obviously was becoming. You know, his thoughts had to be expressed through these means, through performers and pieces of wood and whatever, you know, that our instruments are made of. And that must have become very frustrating because he's sort of writing just a pure means of expression. Um, and in 111, there's Charles Rosen writes really beautifully about this. There's this the climax of the second movement. You kind of implicitly hear the note and it's not actually played. It's sort of like the tension is just left there and you fill it in yourself. So it's like you're hearing it in your own mind, the way Beethoven must have heard music by that point. You know, it's barely articulated. You know.
Well, once again, I'm thinking of a conversation with Richard O'Neill in that same idea. So when you're imagining, so Beethoven is a piano virtuoso, so he knows, he understands the mechanics of the instrument and the mechanics of the physicality. But when you're imagining, um, when you can't hear it and you can't manifest it yourself, and it is a product of your imagination, the imagination is that much more fleet, and the journey from one note to the next. And Richard was talking about just the physical nature of having to move your arm and the bow across the instrument, that is just completely not taken into consideration anymore.
Right, right. And what's funny is even at the very beginning, I think when we play Beethoven when he's young and he's writing, there's already that there. It's interesting. So it's like built into the personality a little bit of like, who cares what's possible? It's sort of unnatural often what he'll ask you to do. Um, and so that's even before, you know, he loses his hearing and that becomes such a characteristic of his life. Something is there about needing to be expressed that's the mechanics are barely sufficient, and that's part of the appeal of the music, and it's also why it feels like something, you know, a little liberating, because you get the feeling that if you miss some notes, it's like I'm not sure Beethoven would have cared all that much. Like it's and that's it's that is another side of his personality that is very appealing.
Yeah. So given given the stature of the piece, and where this and where it lies in the catalog, does does how does that impact your approach to it as a piano player? And
Yeah, well,
when did you first encounter the piece? And
you know,
as a
it's
player, not as a listener, but as a player.
as a player. Well, I learned this piece because of you. I really did learn it because of you. I, of course, knew the piece and I had listened to it. It's not played much as you come up as a student by other students so much. It's, in my experience anyway, it's a little discouraged for students to take it on for a variety of reasons, which I think makes some sense to me. Um, it is, however, what's interesting about the piece is it's much more digestible for both the pianist and the audience than like a Hammerklavier, right? There's um, there's all the characteristics of late Beethoven, and there's this incredible celestial quality to that second movement. But there's something so immediately clear about the yin and the yang aspect of the piece in terms of the relationship of the first movement to the second movement, what is accomplished there. that almost anyone can sit down and listen to this piece and get something really, really profound out of it, which I can't say that's true of the Hammer Clavier Sonata, which is like, for people who don't know, like the peak of his complexity for the piano. This is a piece that when you play Hammer Clavier, it sounds like it's modern music practically, written today, but like actually more complicated than modern music being written today. So, you know, I think I was fortunate to come to the piece having had a pretty big background in Beethoven's music. I mean, I've played a lot of the sonatas at this point, played a lot of his chamber music, been fortunate enough to play a lot of the violin sonatas, all the cello sonatas with different partners, and have, I've just sort of been around the composer's work a lot. And so, like, when I see his language, it's something that I when I sight read something by Beethoven, I sort of feel like I'm talking to someone who I sort of know, So it's so cool to do this sonata after that background, because you're like, yeah, I this language, and look at what he does here, and look at what, and this is so amazing, and you're in a discovery mode that is on comfortable, not comfortable, it's the wrong word with Beethoven, but at least on somewhat familiar territory. So right away with the second movement, you get into questions of time, dilation of time, right? The pulse, because you have like a very simple melody that gradually becomes filled in. The space of time becomes filled in. So I thought of this analogy of, like, you zoom in on a picture deeper, 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 and you keep seeing more and more of a different picture every time you zoom in. And then he pulls you out all the way and you're back to the beginning. And the way he does the zoom out is what's really absolutely incredible about this piece. There's this manipulation of time that is, I don't know if I've experienced anything like that on stage. Maybe I did another piece for you, Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time. A totally different technique, but like somehow something similar about that perception of the passage of time. But it's, I really honestly have to thank you for this opportunity to learn and play the piece. We also played it many times on this week, which for me was incredible to get to do it, basically almost every night, boom, 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 and to just learn from that and think about it. And so it was a great week.
It was a great week. We when I come to these videos, and this was another video that had been set to one side for some reason. I don't remember. So we only rediscovered it last week.
Yeah.
And when you we put these together, you just get flooded with the memory of what the week was and the intensity of the performance and what it was like to be in the audience.
Well, and that was a remarkable program too, because I remember that was also the first time I had heard the different trains, the Reich piece that you put on. I had heard that in school and studied it, but I had actually never seen it live. And that was very powerful. And then the C minor Beethoven Violin Sonata was the opener with Kristen Lee. So that was
that was an epic program. That was yeah. Yeah, it's still, yeah. I cannot wait until we get back on the stage. But I think dear listeners, dear friends, it will not be hard for you to, through this video, appreciate the intensity of what was happening in the hall. It's a wonderful performance by Gilles. So thanks for taking this 15 minutes or 20 minutes after a long day's teaching. And here we have, from February 12th, 2019, Gilles Vonsattel and Beethoven's Piano Sonata in C minor, opus 111. Thanks, Gilles.
My pleasure.